Behind the grand gates of Buckingham Palace, a conversation took place that would change the face of British royal tradition forever. Three military generals sat across from King Charles III in his private study, their uniforms crisp but their faces grave. The topic wasn't war or national security, it was about his wife, Queen Camilla, and a decision that would send shockwaves through the monarchy. "Your Majesty," General Harrison began, his voice steady but firm, "we need to discuss the 2026 Trooping the Colour ceremony." What followed was a request so unprecedented, so bold, that even the king, who had weathered decades of royal scandals, felt his breath catch. The military leadership wanted Camilla removed from the ceremony's central proceedings, replaced entirely by the Wales family. Their reasoning would expose secrets that the palace had desperately tried to keep hidden and reveal a growing crisis that threatened to tear apart the very foundation of the modern monarchy. This is the untold story of how a single decision about a ceremonial parade became the catalyst for the biggest royal upheaval since the death of Queen Elizabeth II. It's a tale of hidden resentments, military rebellion, public opinion warfare, and a family dynasty fighting for its survival in an unforgiving modern world. The truth about why Camilla was cut from Trooping the Colour is far more complex and shocking than anyone could have imagined. The autumn leaves crunched beneath General Margaret Harrison's polished boots as she walked across the courtyard of Wellington Barracks. It was October 2025, and the crisp London air carried with it the weight of an approaching storm that had nothing to do with the weather. In her briefcase, she carried documents that would either save the monarchy's relationship with the British military or destroy it entirely. General Harrison had served the crown for 35 years, rising through the ranks from a young lieutenant to become the first woman to hold the position of Chief of the General Staff. She had commanded troops in Afghanistan, led peacekeeping missions in the Balkans, and earned the respect of every soldier under her command. But nothing in her distinguished career had prepared her for the conversation she was about to have with King Charles III. The trouble had been brewing for months, though its roots stretched back much further. It began with whispered complaints in officers' messes across the country, grew into formal concerns raised in military briefings, and had now reached a crescendo that could no longer be ignored. The issue was Queen Camilla and her increasingly prominent role in military ceremonies. The first major incident had occurred during the previous year's Remembrance Day service. Camilla had arrived 15 minutes late to the ceremony at the cenotaph, causing a delay that rippled through the precisely choreographed event. While the palace had blamed traffic, military sources knew better. Security footage from her route showed her motorcade had stopped for an unscheduled visit to Fortnum and Mason, where the Queen Consort had apparently decided she needed to pick up some specialty tea. That incident alone might have been forgiven as an unfortunate misunderstanding of protocol, but it was followed by a series of similar episodes that painted a troubling pattern. During a ceremony honouring fallen soldiers in Wales, Camilla had been photographed checking her phone while a veteran's widow laid a wreath. At a military hospital visit, she had complained audibly about the smell of disinfectant within earshot of wounded servicemen. Most damaging of all, during a private dinner with senior military officials, she had allegedly remarked that modern soldiers were rather different from the brave men who had served during the World Wars, a comment that several officers interpreted as dismissive of contemporary military service.
General Harrison knew that these incidents had created a crisis of confidence within the armed forces.
The military's relationship with the royal family was built on mutual respect and shared values of duty, honour, and service. For many soldiers, the crown represented the very ideals they had sworn to defend. But Camilla's perceived indifference to military traditions was beginning to undermine that sacred bond. The situation had reached a tipping point 3 weeks earlier, when General Harrison received a formal petition signed by 43 senior officers from across all branches of the military. The document, carefully worded to avoid charges of insubordination, requested that Her Majesty Queen Camilla's participation in military ceremonies be reviewed in light of recent events that have caused concern among serving personnel. The petition was unprecedented in British military history. Never before had senior officers collectively challenged a member of the royal family's involvement in ceremonial duties. It represented a level of discontent that, if left unaddressed, could seriously damage the military's traditional loyalty to the crown. General Harrison had spent sleepless nights reviewing the petition and considering her options. She could ignore it, hoping the officers' concerns would fade with time. She could address it privately within military channels, asking the officers to withdraw their complaint. Or she could take the nuclear option, bringing the matter directly to the king himself. The decision was made easier by intelligence reports that had crossed her desk just days after receiving the petition. The palace's own polling data, obtained through discreet channels, showed that public approval of Queen Camilla had dropped to its lowest point since her marriage to Charles. More troubling still, focus groups conducted among military families revealed deep skepticism about her commitment to the armed forces. The reports painted a picture of a royal consort who was seen as out of touch with military life and dismissive of the sacrifices made by service members and their families. Comments from the focus groups were particularly harsh. "She doesn't understand what we go through," said one army wife. "My husband served 3 tours in Afghanistan, and she can't even show up on time to honor the dead," remarked a veteran's daughter. These findings aligned with what General Harrison had been hearing through unofficial channels. Regimental commanders reported declining morale when Camilla was scheduled to attend military events. Some units had privately requested that she not visit their bases, citing scheduling conflicts that everyone understood were diplomatic excuses. The situation was further complicated by the contrast with the Wales family. Prince William, as heir to the throne, had served as a search and rescue helicopter pilot with the Royal Air Force. His military experience was genuine and respected by serving personnel. Princess Catherine had thrown herself into supporting military charities and had developed genuine relationships with military families. Their children, while young, were already being groomed to understand and respect military traditions. During joint appearances, the difference in reception was stark. When the Wales family appeared at military events, crowds of servicemen and their families would gather eagerly, faces bright with genuine enthusiasm. When Camilla appeared alone or with Charles, the response was polite but noticeably cooler. The military's preference for William and Catherine was becoming impossible to ignore. General Harrison had also received concerning reports from international military partners. Allied commanders had begun making subtle inquiries about the British royal family's commitment to military affairs. During a NATO meeting in Brussels, a French general had diplomatically suggested that perhaps Prince William might be a more appropriate representative for future joint military ceremonies. The implication was clear. Britain's allies were beginning to question the monarchy's military credibility under Camilla's influence. The upcoming Trooping the Colour ceremony for 2026 represented a crucial test. The event, which celebrated the King's official birthday, was the military's most prominent public display of loyalty to the Crown. It involved over 1,400 soldiers from the Household Division, along with hundreds of horses and musical instruments. The ceremony was watched by millions worldwide, and represented the very essence of British military pageantry. Traditionally, the Queen Consort would play a central role in the ceremony, riding alongside the King in a carriage procession and taking part in the inspection of troops. But General Harrison and her colleagues had grave concerns about featuring Camilla so prominently in an event that was meant to showcase the military's pride and professionalism. The General's military aide, Colonel James Mitchell, had conducted his own informal survey among the soldiers who would participate in the ceremony. His findings were sobering. While the troops remained loyal to King Charles and expressed excitement about the possibility of the Wales family's involvement, mention of Queen Camilla's participation was met with resigned acceptance rather than enthusiasm. "The lads will do their duty, ma'am," Colonel Mitchell had reported, "but their hearts aren't in it when it comes to the Queen Consort. They see her as someone who doesn't really understand or value what they do." This sentiment was particularly strong among the younger soldiers, many of whom had enlisted during the final years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign. They remembered the late Queen's unwavering support for the military and her genuine interest in their welfare. To them, Camilla represented a departure from that tradition of royal engagement with the armed forces. The international implications were equally concerning. The 2026 Trooping the Colour was expected to be attended by foreign dignitaries and military attachés from around the world. It would be a showcase of British military excellence and royal tradition. But if the ceremony was overshadowed by questions about Queen Camilla's relationship with the military, it could damage Britain's reputation as a reliable military partner. General Harrison had consulted with her counterparts in the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force. Both had expressed similar concerns about their services' relationships with the Queen Consort. Admiral Sir David Thompson had shared particularly damaging anecdotes about a recent naval review where Camilla had appeared bored and distracted throughout the proceedings. Air Chief Marshal Susan Wright had reported that pilots under her command were increasingly reluctant to participate in events featuring the Queen Consort. The consensus among the military leadership was clear. Something had to change. The institution of the monarchy was too important to British military culture to allow its relationship with the armed forces to deteriorate further. But approaching the king directly about his wife's behavior would require extraordinary tact and courage. General Harrison had carefully planned her approach. She would present the concerns as a matter of military effectiveness rather than personal criticism of Queen Camilla. She would emphasize the positive aspects of increased Wales family involvement rather than focusing entirely on removing Camilla from the ceremony. Most importantly, she would make it clear that the military's loyalty to the crown itself remained unwavering, even if questions had arisen about specific individuals within the royal family. The walk to Buckingham Palace felt longer than usual as General Harrison made her way through the autumn morning. In her briefcase were the petition from the 43 officers, the polling data about Queen Camilla's declining approval ratings, and a proposed alternative program for the 2026 Trooping the Colour that would feature the Wales family much more prominently. She was accompanied by Admiral Thompson and Air Chief Marshal Wright, both of whom had agreed that the concerns needed to be addressed at the highest level. Together, they represented the collective leadership of Britain's armed forces, a group that had never before found it necessary to formally question a royal family member's role in military affairs. As they approached the palace gates, General Harrison reflected on the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. They were essentially asking the king to sideline his own wife from one of the monarchy's most important ceremonial events. The request was unprecedented, potentially explosive, and could either solve a growing crisis or create an even larger one. The guards at the palace entrance snapped to attention as the three senior officers approached. Their respect was evident and genuine, a reminder of the military's deep-seated loyalty to the institution of the monarchy. But General Harrison knew that this loyalty was being tested by the current situation, and that urgent action was needed to preserve it. Inside the palace, staff members moved with the quiet efficiency that characterized royal operations. But General Harrison detected an undercurrent of tension in their movements, a suggestion that the upcoming meeting had already generated considerable behind-the-scenes discussion. Word of their request for an audience had clearly spread through the palace hierarchy, and everyone seemed to understand the significance of what was about to unfold. As they were escorted through the palace's ornate corridors, General Harrison wondered how King Charles would receive their unprecedented request. The king was known for his deep respect for military service and his understanding of the armed forces' importance to the monarchy. But he was also a devoted husband who had waited decades to marry Camilla and would not take kindly to criticism of her performance in royal duties. The stakes could not have been higher. The military's relationship with the royal family formed the backbone of Britain's constitutional system. If that relationship deteriorated further, it could undermine the monarchy's legitimacy and the military's morale. But if their intervention succeeded, it might preserve the traditional bonds between crown and sword that had served Britain for centuries. As they reached the door to the king's private study, General Harrison took a deep breath and prepared to have the most difficult conversation of her distinguished military career. King Charles III rose from behind his mahogany desk as the three military leaders entered his private study. The room, lined with portraits of his predecessors and shelves filled with leather-bound books, had witnessed countless historic conversations over the centuries, but none quite like the one that was about to unfold. The king's expression was carefully neutral, though General Harrison detected a slight tension around his eyes that suggested he had some idea of why they had requested this urgent meeting. He gestured for them to sit in the comfortable chairs arranged around a small table near the window, a setting that felt more like a friendly consultation than a formal military briefing. General Harrison, Admiral Thompson, Air Chief Marshal Wright, Charles said, his voice carrying the measured tone he had perfected over decades of royal duties. I understand you have some concerns about the upcoming Trooping the Colour ceremony. Please, speak freely. General Harrison exchanged glances with her colleagues before beginning. She had rehearsed this moment countless times, but the reality of sitting across from the king and preparing to discuss his wife's shortcomings was more daunting than any battlefield she had ever faced. Your Majesty, she began, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. We come to you today with the deepest respect for the crown and the strongest commitment to preserving the bond between the monarchy and our armed forces. However, we have concerns that this relationship is facing unprecedented challenges. She placed the petition on the table between them, the document that represented the collective voice of 43 senior military officers. The king's eyes moved to it, but he did not reach for it immediately, waiting for her to continue. We have received formal expressions of concern from officers across all branches of the military regarding certain aspects of recent ceremonial events. These concerns center primarily on protocol issues and what many perceive as a lack of appropriate engagement with military traditions. The king's face remained impassive, but General Harrison noticed his fingers tighten slightly around his teacup. She pressed forward, knowing that diplomatic language could only soften the blow so much. Specifically, Your Majesty, there have been multiple incidents involving Queen Camilla that have created unease among our personnel. The lateness at Remembrance Day, the perceived disinterest during various ceremonies, and comments that have been interpreted as dismissive of modern military service. Charles set down his teacup with deliberate precision.
I see. And what exactly are you proposing, General? Admiral Thompson leaned forward, his weathered face reflecting decades of naval command experience.
Your Majesty, we believe the 2026 Trooping the Colour presents an opportunity to address these concerns, while simultaneously strengthening the monarchy's connection with the younger generation of royals who have demonstrated exceptional rapport with our personnel. The king's eyebrows rose slightly. You're suggesting that my wife be excluded from the ceremony. The directness of his statement hung in the air like a challenge. Air Chief Marshal Wright, the youngest of the three officers and known for her diplomatic skills, took up the response. Your Majesty, we're suggesting that the ceremony might benefit from featuring the Wales family more prominently. Prince William's military service and Princess Catherine's work with military families have created tremendous goodwill among our personnel. The public has also responded very positively to their children's appearances at royal events. Charles stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens. For several minutes he said nothing, apparently lost in thought as he gazed at the manicured grounds where his mother had once walked. When he finally turned back to face them, his expression had hardened. "You must understand the position you're putting me in," he said, his voice carrying an edge that had not been present before. "You're asking me to publicly sideline my wife based on the complaints of a few officers and some unfortunate misunderstandings." General Harrison felt the conversation reaching a critical juncture. She knew that the king's next words could either open the door to a solution or close it permanently. She decided to reveal the full extent of the military's concerns. "Your Majesty, with respect, this goes far beyond a few complaints. We have intelligence suggesting that morale in certain units drops measurably when Queen Camilla is scheduled to visit. We have reports from Allied military commanders questioning Britain's commitment to military traditions. Most concerning of all, we have polling data showing that military families are losing confidence in the royal family's understanding of their sacrifices." She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder containing the focus group reports and polling data. These documents paint a picture of a growing crisis that, if left unaddressed, could seriously damage the monarchy's relationship with the armed forces. Charles returned to his chair and opened the folder, his face growing increasingly somber as he read. The focus group comments were particularly damaging, filled with criticisms that no monarch would want to hear about his spouse. After several minutes of reading, he closed the folder and looked up at the three officers. "These are quite damning," he admitted quietly. "I had no idea the situation had deteriorated to this extent." The king's acknowledgement of the severity of the crisis seemed to shift the dynamic in the room. General Harrison sensed an opening and pressed forward with their proposed solution. "Your Majesty, we believe there's an opportunity here to turn a potential crisis into a triumph. The 26th Trooping the Colour could be reimagined as a celebration of the monarchy's future, with Prince William and Princess Catherine taking central roles alongside yourself. Their children could be featured more prominently, giving the British people a glimpse of the next generation of royals." She pulled out another document, this one containing detailed plans for a revised ceremony. "We've drafted a preliminary program that would showcase the Wales family's connection to the military while maintaining all the traditional elements that make Trooping the Colour such a beloved event." Admiral Thompson added, "The naval review component could feature Prince William in his role as heir to the throne, perhaps with Princess Catherine participating in the inspection of troops. Their presence would generate tremendous enthusiasm among our personnel and the public." Charles studied the proposed program carefully, occasionally asking questions about specific elements or logistics. Despite his initial resistance, he seemed genuinely intrigued by some of the suggestions for involving his grandchildren in age-appropriate ways. "And what role, if any, would you envision for Queen Camilla?" he asked. The three officers had anticipated this question and had developed a carefully considered response. Air Chief Marshal Wright spoke for the group. "Your Majesty, we would suggest a role that plays to the Queen Consort's strengths while avoiding the areas where difficulties have arisen. Perhaps she could host a private reception for visiting dignitaries the evening before the ceremony, or participate in a separate charitable event honoring military families. This would allow her to contribute meaningfully while ensuring the main ceremony proceeds without any potential complications." The king nodded slowly, clearly weighing the political and personal implications of their proposal. General Harrison could see him calculating the various consequences, the public relations benefits of featuring William and Catherine, the potential backlash from Camilla's supporters, the long-term impact on military morale, and the precedent this decision would set for future royal events. I need to discuss this with the Queen Consort, Charles said finally. This decision cannot be made unilaterally, regardless of the military's concerns. The three officers exchanged glances, understanding that this response was probably the best they could hope for under the circumstances. The king was not rejecting their proposal outright, but he was also not agreeing to it immediately. General Harrison decided to play one final card. Your Majesty, there is one additional factor you should consider. We have reason to believe that other Commonwealth realms are watching this situation closely. Canada's Governor-General has privately expressed concerns about Queen Camilla's role in upcoming royal visits. Australia's military leadership has been asking pointed questions about the monarchy's direction under your reign. This information clearly struck a nerve. Charles had long worried about the monarchy's future in the Commonwealth realms, many of which had Republican movements that were eager to exploit any perceived weaknesses in the royal family. The thought that Camilla's performance might be undermining the crown's position in these countries was clearly troubling. What kind of questions? He asked. Admiral Thompson provided the details. During recent discussions with Australian naval commanders, they specifically asked whether future royal visits might feature Prince William instead of Queen Camilla. The implication was that their government would be more comfortable with arrangements that didn't include the Queen Consort. The king's face darkened at this revelation. The Commonwealth realms represented not just political relationships, but personal legacies for him. His mother had worked tirelessly to maintain these connections, and the thought that they might be weakened by his wife's performance was clearly painful. Air Chief Marshal Wright added another concerning detail. We've also received informal feedback from New Zealand's military leadership, suggesting that they would prefer to work directly with Prince William on future ceremonial matters. The message is becoming quite clear across the Commonwealth. There's a strong preference for the younger generation of royals. Charles stood again and walked to a portrait of Queen Elizabeth II that dominated one wall of the study. For a long moment he stared at his mother's image, perhaps remembering her legendary connection with the military and her instinctive understanding of what the armed forces needed from their sovereign. When he turned back to face the three officers, his expression had changed. The protective husband had been replaced by the calculating monarch, weighing the needs of the institution against his personal feelings. I want you to prepare a comprehensive briefing document outlining exactly what you're proposing, he said. Include detailed logistic security considerations and a timeline for implementation. I also want an analysis of how this change would be received by the press and the public. General Harrison felt a surge of hope. The king was not committing to their proposal yet, but he was taking it seriously enough to request detailed planning. That was more progress than she had dared to expect. Your Majesty, we can have that briefing document ready within 48 hours, she replied. Good. I'll also need to speak with Prince William about his willingness to take on an expanded role. This decision affects him and his family significantly, and I won't proceed without his full agreement. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes as they discussed specific details and potential complications. The king asked probing questions about everything from crowd management to media coverage, demonstrating the thoroughness that had characterized his approach to royal duties throughout his life. As the session concluded, Charles offered one final observation that revealed the depth of his dilemma. You must understand that this is not just a ceremonial decision. You're asking me to make a choice that could define my reign and my marriage. The implications extend far beyond a single parade. General Harrison nodded respectfully. We understand the magnitude of what we're asking, Your Majesty. But we also believe that sometimes difficult decisions are necessary to preserve institutions that are larger than any individual.
As the three military leaders left the palace, they felt cautiously optimistic about the king's response.
He had not rejected their proposal, he had not dismissed their concerns, and he had requested detailed planning that suggested serious consideration of their ideas. But they also knew that the hardest part was yet to come. Convincing the king to consider their proposal was just the first step. The real challenge would come when he discussed it with Queen Camilla and Prince William, both of whom would have their own strong opinions about the suggested changes. The fate of the 2026 Trooping the Colour, and perhaps the future direction of the monarchy itself, now hung in the balance. The private quarters of Clarence House fell silent, except for the ticking of an antique mantel clock, as King Charles finished explaining the military's proposal to Queen Camilla. She sat perfectly still in her favourite armchair, her teacup balanced delicately in her hands, but her knuckles had gone white from gripping the saucer too tightly. For nearly 10 minutes, Charles had carefully outlined the concerns raised by the military leadership, the polling data showing her declining approval ratings, and the unprecedented request to reduce her role in the 2026 Trooping the Colour ceremony. He had tried to present it as objectively as possible, but there was no way to soften the essential message. The armed forces no longer wanted her as their ceremonial leader. "So they want to replace me with William and Catherine," Camilla said finally, her voice carefully controlled but with an undercurrent of hurt that Charles had rarely heard from his usually resilient wife. "They want to push me aside like some embarrassing relative who can't be trusted in public." Charles reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand. "Darling, it's not quite that simple. They're not questioning your commitment or your intentions. They're concerned about public perception and military morale." Camilla set down her teacup with deliberate precision and stood, walking to the window that overlooked the garden where they had held their wedding reception nearly 20 years earlier. The memories of that day, when they had finally been able to marry after decades of controversy, seemed to hang in the air between them. "Do you remember what they said about me then?" she asked, not turning around. "That I would never be accepted. That I was destroying the monarchy. That the people would never forgive me for Diana. I thought we had moved past all that." The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and Charles felt his own anger rising at the military leaders who had put him in this impossible position. But he also knew that ignoring their concerns could lead to an even more damaging crisis down the road. "You have moved past it," he said firmly. "Your approval ratings were climbing steadily until these recent incidents. The problem isn't who you are, it's about understanding the unique expectations that come with military ceremonies." Camilla turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Unique expectations? Like showing up on time and pretending to be fascinated by endless parades of soldiers? Like smiling constantly even when my feet are killing me from standing in heels for hours? Like never having a human moment of exhaustion or distraction?" Her frustration poured out in a way that Charles had rarely witnessed. Usually, Camilla handled royal criticism with grace and humor, deflecting negative comments with wit and focusing on her charitable work. But this felt different. This was an attack on her competence, in an area that she had never fully embraced. "I've spent 20 years trying to prove myself worthy of this family," she continued. "I've supported dozens of charities, attended thousands of events, and smiled through every criticism and cruel headline. And now the military wants to humiliate me publicly because I was late to one ceremony and made a few unfortunate comments." Charles stood and moved to join her at the window. "It's not about humiliation." The military leaders were actually quite respectful in how they presented their concerns. They're offering alternative roles that would still allow you to contribute meaningfully. "Alternative roles," Camilla repeated bitterly. "You mean smaller, less visible roles where I can't embarrass anyone, hidden away at private receptions while Catherine gets to play queen in front of millions of people." The mention of Princess Catherine clearly struck a nerve. Charles knew that Camilla had always felt overshadowed by her daughter-in-law's natural grace and intuitive understanding of royal protocol. While their relationship was cordial, there was an underlying tension born from comparisons that Camilla invariably seemed to lose. "Catherine has advantages that you didn't have," Charles said carefully. "She's younger. She had more time to prepare for royal life. And she doesn't carry the historical baggage that we both do. But that doesn't diminish your own contributions or your value to this family." Camille laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Historical baggage. Is that what we're calling it now? The fact that I was the other woman, the wicked stepmother who stole the prince from his perfect princess? Do you think the military would be making these complaints if I had Diana's approval ratings?" The invocation of Diana's name created a chill in the room. It was a topic that Charles and Camilla rarely discussed directly, but it colored every aspect of their public life. Diana's ghost seemed to hover over every royal event, every public appearance, every moment when Camilla was compared unfavorably to the memory of the beloved princess. "This has nothing to do with Diana," Charles said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. "This is about current circumstances and finding the best way forward for the monarchy." Before Camilla could respond, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Prince William entered after being invited in, his expression suggesting that he already knew why he had been summoned to Clarence House. "Father Camilla," he said with a respectful nod to both of them, "I understand you wanted to discuss the trooping the color arrangements." The presence of the heir to the throne changed the dynamic in the room immediately. William represented not just the monarchy's future, but also the military's preferred alternative to Camilla's ceremonial role. His arrival made the conversation less personal but more politically charged. Charles gestured for William to sit down and quickly summarized the military's proposal. As he spoke, William's expression remained carefully neutral, but Camilla watched him closely, looking for any sign of enthusiasm or ambition that might suggest he was behind the military's request. "I want to be clear," Charles concluded, that this decision hasn't been made yet. I'm consulting with everyone who would be affected before determining the best course of action. William was quiet for a long moment before responding. Have you asked Catherine what she thinks about taking on such a prominent role? This would be a significant increase in her ceremonial duties at a time when we're trying to balance royal obligations with raising our children. It was a diplomatic response that neither embraced nor rejected the proposal, but Camilla detected something else in his tone. Despite his careful words, there seemed to be an underlying excitement about the possibility of leading such a major royal event. She had seen that same look in his eyes before, during moments when he was contemplating his future role as king. Catherine and I haven't discussed the specifics yet, Charles admitted. I wanted to understand your initial reaction before involving more family members. My initial reaction, William said slowly, is that we need to do what's best for the monarchy and the military. If the armed forces are genuinely concerned about current arrangements, then we have to take that seriously. Camilla felt her heart sink. William wasn't explicitly supporting her removal from the ceremony, but he wasn't defending her either. His response sounded like that of a future king already calculating the political implications, rather than that of a stepson concerned about her feelings. And what about what's best for family unity? She asked, her voice sharper than she had intended. What message does it send if we constantly rearrange royal duties based on public opinion polls and media criticism? William turned to look at her directly for the first time since entering the room. With respect, Camilla, this isn't about media criticism. This is about the military leadership of our country expressing formal concerns about ceremonial arrangements. That's something we can't ignore. The exchange highlighted the fundamental tension that had always existed in their relationship. While William had accepted Camilla as his father's wife and had worked to maintain family harmony, he had never fully embraced her as a royal colleague. Their interactions remained polite but distant, lacking the warmth and mutual support that characterized his relationship with other family members. Charles sensed the growing tension and tried to redirect the conversation toward practical considerations. The military has requested a detailed briefing document outlining their proposed changes. Once we see the specifics, we'll be better positioned to evaluate the merits of their suggestions. What kind of specifics? Camilla asked. Charles consulted his notes from the morning's meeting. They want to feature William more prominently in the inspection of troops, possibly have Catherine participate in the carriage procession, and include the children in age-appropriate ways. They've also suggested alternative roles for you that would still allow meaningful participation. As Charles outlined the military's vision, Camilla could picture exactly how it would unfold. William and Catherine would be the stars of the show, radiating youth and vigor, while she was relegated to hosting tea parties for foreign dignitaries. The media would inevitably frame it as the monarchy's new generation pushing aside the old guard. And what happens after trooping the color? She asked. If we agree to this, what's to stop them from making similar requests about other ceremonies? Will I gradually be phased out of all major royal events? It was a perceptive question that went to the heart of her concerns. If the military could successfully pressure the royal family to reduce her role in one major ceremony, it would set a precedent that other institutions might follow. Her position as queen consort could be slowly eroded through a series of seemingly reasonable requests for changes. William seemed to recognize the validity of her concern. That's something we'd need to establish clear boundaries around. If we make changes to trooping the color, it should be presented as a unique situation rather than a template for future decisions. But Camilla wasn't convinced. How do we control that narrative? How do we prevent this from being seen as a rejection of my role as queen consort? Charles had been wrestling with the same question. Any public announcement about changes to the ceremony would inevitably be analyzed and interpreted by the media, royal correspondents, and political commentators. The risk of it being portrayed as a humiliation for Camilla was significant. We would need a very carefully crafted communication strategy, he admitted. Perhaps we could frame it as an evolution of the ceremony to better reflect the monarchy's future direction, with you taking on new responsibilities that better match your interests and expertise.
Camilla shook her head. Charles, listen to yourself.
You're already talking about this as if it's decided. You're discussing how to spin my demotion rather than whether it should happen at all. The accusation hung in the air, and Charles realized that she was right. Despite his intention to remain neutral until all perspectives were considered, he had unconsciously begun to accept the military's proposal as inevitable. The weight of their arguments and the potential consequences of ignoring their concerns had already begun to shape his thinking. I'm not trying to push you into anything, he said. But I do have to consider what's best for the institution of the monarchy. If the military leadership is genuinely concerned about our relationship with the armed forces, that's not something I can dismiss lightly. The word institution seemed to crystallize something for Camilla. She looked at her husband with an expression that mixed hurt and understanding, as if she was finally seeing clearly how the decision-making process actually worked in the royal family.
The institution, she repeated quietly. Always the institution first, isn't it?
Not the person, not the feelings, not even the marriage. Just what's best for the crown.
Charles felt the weight of her words and the lifetime of sacrifice they represented. Camilla had given up her privacy, her freedom, and much of her identity to become queen consort.
She had endured decades of public criticism in comparison to Diana. And now, when she had finally achieved some measure of acceptance, she was being asked to step back again for the good of the institution.
It's not that simple, he began, but Camilla held up a hand to stop him. No, Charles, it really is that simple. You have a choice between supporting your wife and appeasing your military commanders, and we all know which one you'll choose, because we all know which one a king must choose.
The conversation continued for another hour, with William occasionally offering input but primarily observing the dynamic between his father and stepmother. Various options were discussed, from minor modifications to Camilla's role, to completely restructuring the ceremony around the Wales family.
But as the afternoon wore on, it became increasingly clear that the fundamental question wasn't about logistics or protocol. It was about power, legitimacy, and the monarchy's willingness to sacrifice individual members for institutional preservation. When William finally left Clarence House that evening, the issue remained unresolved.
But the trajectory seemed set. The military had presented a compelling case for change. Charles was struggling to find reasons to reject their proposal, and Camilla was beginning to accept that her position was ultimately expendable if it served the monarchy's broader interests. The next phase of the crisis would determine not just the future of Trooping the Colour, but the balance of power within the royal family itself. 3 weeks after the military leadership's unprecedented meeting with King Charles, the palace announced that the 2026 Trooping the Colour ceremony would feature an enhanced role for the Wales family in recognition of their growing importance to the monarchy's future. The carefully worded statement made no direct mention of Queen Camilla's reduced participation, but royal watchers immediately understood its significance. The decision had not come easily. In the days following that tense afternoon at Clarence House, Charles had found himself caught between competing pressures that seemed to intensify with each passing hour. The military had delivered their promised briefing document, a comprehensive 40-page analysis that laid out in devastating detail the scope of their concerns about Queen Camilla's relationship with the armed forces. The document included polling data showing that her approval ratings among military families had dropped to just 28%, compared to William and Catherine's combined rating of 76%. It contained testimonials from serving officers describing declining morale in units that Camilla was scheduled to visit. Most damaging of all, it revealed that 3 Commonwealth nations had privately requested that future royal visits feature Prince William rather than the Queen Consort. But the military's case was not the only factor influencing the King's decision. Private polling commissioned by the palace showed that public support for a greater role for the Wales family in major ceremonies was overwhelming. 73% of respondents favoured seeing more of William and Catherine at royal events, while only 41% expressed enthusiasm for Queen Camilla's ceremonial duties. The generational divide in the polling was particularly stark. Among respondents under 40, support for featuring the Wales family more prominently rose to 87%. Comments from focus groups reflected a clear preference for the younger royals. They seem more relatable, said one participant. William served in the military, and Catherine seems to really care about the causes she supports. Perhaps even more concerning for Charles was the international dimension revealed in the briefing documents. The Canadian Governor-General had formally requested that Prince William lead the royal delegation for Canada's upcoming national celebrations. The Australian Prime Minister had made similar overtures through diplomatic channels. New Zealand's military leadership had specifically asked whether Princess Catherine might visit their country instead of Queen Camilla. The message from the Commonwealth realms was unmistakable. They saw the Wales family as the monarchy's future and wanted to align themselves with that future sooner rather than later. For Charles, who had long worried about Republican movements in these countries, the implications were deeply troubling. The decision-making process had been complicated by Queen Camilla's own response to the crisis. After the initial shock and hurt of learning about the military's concerns, she had surprised everyone by taking a more pragmatic approach than anticipated. In a private conversation with Charles, she had made an observation that would ultimately influence his final decision. "You know, Charles," she had said one evening as they walked through the gardens at Highgrove, "I've spent 20 years trying to prove that I belong in this family. Maybe it's time to accept that some battles can't be won through willpower alone."
Her resignation was both heartbreaking and liberating for the king. It removed the personal pressure he had felt to defend her position while also making him acutely aware of the sacrifices she had made for the crown. But it also cleared the way for him to make a decision based purely on institutional considerations. The final factor that tipped the scales was a conversation Charles had with his mother's former private secretary, Sir Edward Young, who had served Queen Elizabeth II for over a decade. Sir Edward's perspective carried special weight because of his intimate knowledge of how the late Queen had navigated similar challenges during her reign. "Your Majesty," Sir Edward had said during a private meeting at Windsor Castle, "Queen Elizabeth faced many moments when she had to choose between personal preferences and institutional needs. She always said that the crown must be bigger than any individual, even the monarch himself." He had gone on to share insights from the Queen's private papers that revealed how she had sometimes made painful decisions about family members' roles in order to protect the monarchy's reputation. The precedent was clear. When the institution's welfare conflicted with personal loyalties, the institution had to take priority. The conversation that would ultimately seal Queen Camilla's fate took place on a cold December morning at Adelaide Cottage, where Prince William and Princess Catherine lived with their children. Charles had requested the meeting to gauge their willingness to take on the expanded roles envisioned by the military leadership. Catherine's response had been particularly illuminating. "We're honored by the confidence being shown in us," she had said. "But we want to make sure we're not inadvertently undermining Camilla's position. She's worked very hard to establish herself in this family." Her concern for Queen Camilla's feelings was genuine, but Charles also detected an underlying excitement about the opportunity. Catherine had always been cautious about stepping into more prominent roles too quickly, but the idea of leading such a major royal ceremony clearly appealed to her sense of duty and ambition. William had been more direct in his response. "If this is what the military needs from us, then we'll do our duty. The relationship between the Crown and the armed forces is too important to let personal considerations override institutional requirements." His words echoed the advice Sir Edward had shared about Queen Elizabeth's approach to difficult decisions. William was already thinking like a future king, weighing competing interests and prioritizing the monarchy's long-term welfare over short-term harmony. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Charles received an unexpected phone call from the Archbishop of Canterbury. The conversation was ostensibly about other matters, but the Archbishop made a passing comment that resonated deeply with the king. "Your Majesty," he had said, "I've been reflecting on the nature of sacrifice in royal service. Sometimes the greatest service comes not from what we do, but from what we're willing to give up for the greater good." The words seemed to provide a framework for understanding Queen Camilla's situation in spiritual terms. Her step back from the ceremony could be framed not as a failure or humiliation, but as a noble sacrifice made for the benefit of the monarchy and the military relationship. When Charles finally made his decision, he did so with characteristic thoroughness. He personally called each of the 3 military leaders who had brought him the original concerns, thanking them for their service and assuring them that their recommendations would be fully implemented. He met privately with Queen Camilla to discuss the decision and to ensure that she felt supported despite the outcome. Most importantly, he worked with his communications team to craft a narrative that would present the changes as a positive evolution rather than a rejection of his wife. The official announcement emphasized the exciting opportunity to showcase the monarchy's future generation while noting that Queen Camilla would continue to play vital roles in other royal ceremonies and charitable activities. The public reaction to the announcement was largely positive, though not without controversy. Royal commentators praised the decision as a sign that the monarchy was adapting to changing public expectations. Military veterans organizations issued statements expressing satisfaction with the king's responsiveness to their concerns. Opinion polls showed strong support for giving William and Catherine more prominent roles. However, there was also criticism from some quarters. Women's rights advocates argued that Queen Camilla was being unfairly blamed for minor protocol lapses that would have been overlooked if committed by a man. Some commentators suggested that the decision reflected ongoing prejudice against Camilla based on her role in Charles and Diana's relationship. The most stinging criticism came from a group of female members of Parliament who issued a joint statement condemning what they called the systematic undermining of Queen Camilla's legitimate role. Their statement argued that the decision sent a troubling message about women's place in public life and the monarchy's willingness to sacrifice its female members to appease critics. But these critical voices were largely drowned out by the positive response from military families, Commonwealth leaders, and the general public. The palace's polling showed that approval ratings for the royal family as a whole increased following the announcement.
suggesting that the decision had strengthened rather than weakened the monarchy's position. Queen Camilla herself maintained a dignified silence about the decision, appearing at scheduled engagements with her usual grace and professionalism. In private, however, those close to her reported that she was deeply hurt by what she saw as a betrayal of her years of loyal service to the crown. The impact on her relationship with Prince William and Princess Catherine was more complex. While both had reached out to express their concern for her feelings, there was an inevitable awkwardness in their interactions. Camilla could not help but see them as the beneficiaries of her misfortune, even though she intellectually understood that they had not sought her removal from the ceremony. Perhaps the most significant consequence of the decision was its effect on King Charles himself. Those who knew him well observed that he seemed to age visibly in the weeks following the announcement, as if the weight of having to choose between his wife and his institution had taken a profound toll. He had made the decision that his advisors and the military leadership wanted, but the personal cost was evident to anyone who looked closely. The 26th Trooping the Colour ceremony itself proved to be a spectacular success. William and Catherine performed their roles with the grace and professionalism that had made them such popular figures. Their children charmed the crowds with their well-behaved participation in the carriage procession. The military units involved performed with exceptional precision, their enthusiasm for the new arrangements clearly visible to the millions watching worldwide. Queen Camilla attended the ceremony as a spectator rather than a participant, watching from a window at Buckingham Palace alongside other family members who were not directly involved in the proceedings. Photos of her watching the parade showed her maintaining a composed expression, but royal watchers noted that she seemed smaller somehow, diminished by her removal from the center of the action. The success of the revised ceremony validated the military leadership's instincts about public preferences and royal effectiveness. But it also raised questions about the precedent that had been set. If Queen Camilla could be removed from one major ceremony based on military concerns and public opinion polling, what was to stop similar decisions about other royal events? In the months that followed, observers noted subtle changes in how royal duties were allocated. William and Catherine began receiving more high-profile assignments, while Queen Camilla's schedule increasingly focused on smaller, more specialized events. The shift was gradual and diplomatically handled, but the trend was unmistakable. The long-term implications of the Trooping the Colour decision extended far beyond a single ceremony. It represented a fundamental shift in how the monarchy balanced institutional needs against personal relationships. It demonstrated that even the king's wife was not immune from being sidelined if her performance was deemed inadequate by powerful constituencies. Most significantly, it marked the beginning of an accelerated transition toward the Wales family's assumption of royal leadership. What had been planned as a gradual handover of responsibilities over many years was compressed into a much shorter timeframe, driven by public demand and institutional pressure. For Queen Camilla, the decision represented both an ending and a beginning. While her role in major state ceremonies had been diminished, she found new purpose in focusing on causes that had always been close to her heart. Her work with literacy charities and domestic violence organizations flourished as she channeled her energy into areas where her contributions were unquestioned. The story of why Camilla was cut from the 2026 Trooping the Colour ultimately became a defining moment for the modern British monarchy. It showed how an institution that prided itself on tradition and continuity could still adapt rapidly when faced with changing public expectations and institutional pressures. But it also revealed the human cost of such adaptations. The personal sacrifices required when individual desires conflict with institutional needs. In the end, Queen Camilla's removal from the ceremony was not about personal failings or deliberate disrespect. It was about a monarchy's determination to survive and thrive in an increasingly demanding modern world, regardless of who might be left behind in the process.